And I'll go ahead and say that Philip's off only by 1 decade. I've been at UK for 40 years, but not all of that has been involved in the business that I'm going to speak to you about tonight. The poll that's up there was kind of devised by me kind of off the cuff and probably had some additional things that Philip put in there. And I have to admit that I haven't done anything profound here, but he wanted me to provide you guys with some questions. So Philip, with your permission, I'm going to share my screen and start in.
Yes, sir. Go right ahead.
Okay. What we're going to talk about here is tonight is what we call the big three, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. We're going to talk a little bit about what they do in plants and why they're so important, kind of a refresher, I'm sure, for many of you. And then what we'll talk about are some of the individual issues that are still in play as we enter the world of next season, and then we're leaving the world of this season. I'll start with nitrogen. Nitrogen is a real important nutrient for plants. It's one of the macronutrients, one of the primary macronutrients. It's a major part of the chlorophyll molecule, which is essential for what plants do in terms of photosynthesis. It combines with other elements like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, sulfur to create amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. The amino acids are used in forming the protoplasm, site of cell division, and they're important, therefore, for plant growth and development. And all plant enzymes are made up of proteins, so nitrogen is needed for all enzymatic reactions in a plant. This is an example over here on this particular side. We have a chlorophyll molecule on the left, and on the right is kind of a prototypical amino acid showing the role of nitrogen. That's the N in each of those particular entities. Phosphorus is also a primary macronutrient, although typically in plants it is at about 1/10 the concentration that nitrogen and potassium are. It plays a major role in energy storage and transfer through its role on ADP and ATP. It's a fundamental part of both RNA and DNA structures, making it a major part of the genetic information the plant acts upon and passes on from one generation to the next. It's extremely important to this passing on of generations because the highest concentration of phosphorus that we find is in the seeds of a mature plant, and is required in a very large quantity when that seed germinates, because the young cells forming shoot and root tips have a high metabolism and cell division is quite rapid. Potassium is different than nitrogen and phosphorus. It's not a component of an organic plant compound. It's typically in the plant as a cation, K+, and it balances out the organic acids. It provides electroneutrality roles in that space. It is an enzyme activator in that role, promoting metabolism, plant metabolism. It also has a role in regulating plant water use because its concentration and concentration changes control the opening and the closing of the leaf stomata. Water is released when it's open to cool the plant, and then CO2, carbon dioxide, and oxygen also have flows, oxygen moving out as CO2 moves in. In the act of photosynthesis, potassium has the role of maintaining this electrical balance at the site of ATP production. Potassium definitely has a role in plant disease resistant, and because of that resistance role, potassium has a role in improving both grain and seed size and fruit and vegetable quality. We have here kind of a table of the structural nutrients and the primary and secondary macronutrients. And we're going to focus tonight on these ones here that are the primary macronutrients. Nitrogen, which in the soil solution, this form that's taken up by plants is either a nitrate anion or an ammonium cation. Phosphate, there are two anions, negatively charged species that are taken up by plants. And then potassium is taken up as the cation. I'm going to activate my highlighter here. And we'll use blue because we're all partial to blue here at UK. We're going to talk a little bit about the secondary macronutrients, magnesium and sulfur, next week. Now, there are three ways in which a nutrient will come to be at the surface of the root and present itself for uptake. The first of those is literally as the roots explore the soil, as they move through the pores of the soil, the nutrients that are nearby are basically acquired through what we call root interception. There's not much difference than if, I'm moving through a room and I grab something off a table as I go past it. But that doesn't account for much of the nutrients, particularly these primary macronutrients, in terms of how they're acquired by the plant root. The movement of nutrients to the root surface is really important. And there are two major ways in which this happens: mass flow and diffusion. When you have a mobile nutrient in the soil solution, like nitrate is very mobile, the moving water is already headed to the root as the root takes up water, and the nitrate moves with that water into the root, to the root, and then into the root. There are enzymes that control the transformation of nitrate as it moves across the root inside the plant. Diffusion is a different animal. There are certain nutrients that are not very mobile, phosphate and potassium among them. And what happens there is the plant enzymes start pumping those nutrients into the plant and reduce the concentration at the root surface such that diffusion starts to move. That concentration gradient causes more and more potassium and phosphorus to fall. You might say fall down the concentration gradient towards the root surface. This is extremely important in applications like banding, where what we're trying to do is present a higher concentration closer to the root so that the root and the plant do not have to do so much work. When a root does work, it burns carbon that it would have otherwise perhaps used to make yield or dry matter. So the bottom line is, one of the reasons we ban nutrients like phosphate is to cause the root to do less work and be able to acquire that nutrient more easily. Nitrate is a mobile nutrient, so we don't have to worry about placing it too close, except maybe when roots are really small. There's a certain amount of nitrogen that can be banded or placed close to a smaller plant to get it off to a good start. But it does make certain application patterns kind of problematic. For example, if you're applying nitrogen to corn with a Y drop device, you're really not doing much relative to if you just dropped it down the center of the row, because the roots are going to get moving water in any application, and they're not doing much work because the water is already moving there. This is a diagram that kind of illustrates the different amounts of soil that are subject to absorption of these nutrients around an individual plant. So we have in this space here, this is the volume of soil that is being relieved of its nitrate, moving a good distance to this growing plant. And this volume gets bigger and bigger as the plant root system gets larger and larger. But this little volume around each root is the amount where you get the immobile nutrients absorbed from. Now, obviously, as more roots are formed, as root hairs are formed, as mycorrhizal fungi create associations with this root system, they also increase the amount of surface area that's in these absorption zones, and that does indeed increase the root volume that's extracting both P and K from. That's important to understand when you're trying to manage things like how you're going to place these nutrients. Now, if we don't have the nutrients in place, we can have different kinds of stresses. This is an example of nitrogen deficiency on tobacco. In the plant, nitrogen is a fairly mobile nutrient, so the deficiency symptoms typically occur on these lower leaves as a yellow color. In corn, it'll be the midrib that'll actually yellow up first and then finally turns yellow throughout. Up here on the upper right, we have a phosphorus deficient plant. Again, phosphorus tends to be more deficient in the older leaves. This plant's pretty deficient overall, but the younger leaves have less effect than the older leaves in this plant over here. And it's another thing you can't see from this top-down view is this plant is stunted. Phosphorus is a nutrient that if the plant is deficient, you get stunting. Zinc is another one where this happens. Down here we have soybean, and soybean with potassium deficiency develops this edge firing, again on older leaves. All three of these particular macronutrients are mobile within the plant, and the deficiency symptoms tend, it's not a perfect thing, it tend to be formed on the oldest tissue. Now, before I get into what I'm going to talk about, which is some of the things we have to think about as we move forward, this is the very latest fertilizer price survey from DTN, came today to my inbox. You can see that relative to the same time last year, all these prices are up anywhere from 12 to 21%. I have to admit to all of you that I didn't think this would happen. I thought that in a year or so, we would be back to more normal prices, but the problems that we have been facing have persisted and the prices remain. What this means, of course, is we have to remain tight on our nutrient management, tighten it up a little bit more if we can. And we have to do better at what agronomists like myself call the 4 R's. We really have to work hard at getting the right rate, the right timing, with the right source and the right placement. Now, I will admit to you the 4R concept has largely been applied to row crops, but I argue it can be easily applied in forage systems, particularly in pastures, if you consider not just plants and soils, but also the animal component. And I'll touch on that. I'm going to try to be fair to the diversity of crops that Philip told me were represented in the room here. So I'm going to talk not just row crops, but also forage systems, and I'm going to touch on pastures at times as well. One thing is still very important in forage production. It's still, you want to grow your needed forage where and when you need, but you can't overgrow it unless you've got extra storage that you're going to carry over. Now, I will say in Western Kentucky, we've been under a severe drought for the last 12 weeks. And a lot of people are already feeding hay, and people like myself are glad that I had some rolls carried over from last year. But there comes a time when that carryover has reduced quality, and you can hinder animal performance if you're feeding a lot of really old hay. There are other forage considerations with nutrient management that have to be taken into account more than if you're talking about row crops. Most forages are managed in perennial systems. They're not managed as annuals, and therefore you want to maintain your stand health, and its persistence and fertility can contribute to that as kind of an ongoing benefit for maintaining good soil nutrient levels. It can also help with weed competition. My colleague J.D. Green made a presentation back in the fall, previous fall, where he talked about how just adding fertilizer, he did a study where he looked both at fertilizer and at weed control with herbicides, and just adding fertilizer was pretty competitive with herbicides at adding grass dry matter. The problem was the herbicide cost about 1/10 as much. So I'm not advocating, this happens when you use fertilizer, you get improved competition with weeds, but you don't necessarily benefit from it economically. In pasture systems, nutrient removal is animal driven. Most of Kentucky's production is cow-calf, and nutrient removal in milk and meat is rather low. Other losses, however, and I've seen fields that evidence this, erosion, runoff, chemical fixation losses can be important. Chemical fixation is an idea where the soil chemistry itself causes available nutrient levels to decline over time. And in some of our soils, it's more rapid than others. You can avoid erosion and runoff losses with a robust grass stand. You need to do that to slow the water movement, and that stand will quickly take up the soluble nutrients and prevent them from being lost. This is something that John Laurie put together and Chris Teutsch gave to me, where it just shows it's a dynamic model showing imported nutrients, fertilizer, manure, legumes, feed, come in, they cycle within the environment of your operation. You export out calves and beef, but the fact that you're only exporting calves and some as beef, some older cows, means that the nutrient removal per year for a cow-calf pair is only about 10 pounds of N, 7 pounds P2O5, and 1 pound K2O. It's not like a corn, or it's not even at all like your hay production environments, which are used to keep feeding these animals during the winter months. Nutrient needs do vary by crop. This is the total uptake needed to produce a crop. Corn, it's about 170 pounds is removed when we have 180 bushel corn. With 60 bushel beans, it's 180 pounds here. And with grass hay, we remove about 105 pounds of N. Corn is a pretty heavy phosphate user. Soybeans are not bad, but grass hay, a 3-ton, which is a modest hay yield, will remove 54 pounds of P2O5. The real difference between a hay crop and the grain crops is in potash. Typically, you're going to get 120 to 150 pounds of K2O removed. One of the issues here is if you over fertilize with K, it's still going to end up in this grass hay and not end up in the soil. So you've got a touchy situation where you can't over fertilize with potassium because you get luxury consumption by the crop you grow. Beans, corns are less likely to do that. Now, these nutrient needs, most of these can be met from the soil. What we're doing with fertilizer is we're supplementing the soil environment, trying to maintain an adequate level of nutrient availability without mining the soil, but we can't keep fertilizing as if the soil is not there, or we'll eventually overload and lose money or have an environmental issue. To make this assessment of what the soil is able to provide, it's critical that you start with a soil test. And I've been asked by a number of people whether that's more important or less important this year. Given the variability that I've been seeing in terms of yields in areas of the state, I think it's going to be important that producers try to figure out where they're at with a soil test. It's not perfect. Every field can be a bit of a unique case, and in some areas, it can be parts of the field. I've traversed a field recently where the yield monitor, now admittedly yield monitors don't always tell the truth, yield monitor ranged from 0 to 280 bushel per acre in one strip across the field. And the corn was there at 0, but just didn't have any grain on it. It just was all nubbins or barren plants. I argue, though, that the one criterion other than drought that makes it important to soil test is the criterion that when fertilizer prices are high, you really need to target lime and fertilizer applications to the fields where there's a greater potential for economic or a profitable response, because you're fighting the fact that you're going to lose money with excess fertilizer more significantly when the fertilizer price is high. This is just a quick one I got from Chris Teutsch. Taking a composite soil sample, 15 to 20 cores from each area intended for separate nutrient management, is the most important step in the process of soil testing. It's not what the lab does. It's what you do or what whoever is taking the samples for you is doing. If the sample isn't a good sample, what the lab does is inconsequential to the poor result that is caused by that. Now, I'm just going to ask a question here. You get a soil test report, and we know that nutrient levels are an issue. But what's the first thing that we should be taking a look at? What do people think? What's the first thing we ought to be taking a look at? Nobody's going to venture a guess, I see. All right.
pH.
Yay, pH. That's my favorite one too. I'm going to argue it should be pH, because the soil pH is extremely important to overall nutrient availability. And at least as far as I've been able to determine, ag lime is widely available. We haven't had supply chain issues because we have a lot of limestone quarries in the state. I haven't heard of very notable price changes except on the delivery and spreading part of the equation. In other words, the price of lime hasn't gone up much, but the price of delivering and spreading it has gone up because of diesel fuel cost. Well, because of this, it's an input where if you have your pH right and it has an impact on these other things, it makes liming any acid soils you have a pretty high priority, because you can get a fair bang for the buck by doing this. You are maintaining, if you keep the soil pH in the right range, optimal nutrient availability. And in Kentucky, that means phosphorus and zinc on the grain crops. And in the forage crops, it means we want to maintain legume growth and nitrogen fixation, particularly clovers in a lot of these mixed pastures and hayfields. Overall, better chemistry and better biology means you get decent nutrient availability for your bank account because of what you've done to the crop. The drawback with lime is lime needs time. And I'm strongly recommending that, given the dry fall we have, people don't have nearly the excuse they would have in a wet fall not to get the liming done in a timely fashion. This figure is a figure that New South Wales and Australia put out, and Chris Toit and I cabbaged and managed a little bit. This basically says what we have here is what we call the missile diagram. But in reality, it's whenever there's width here, that's where the nutrient availability, where it's thickest, is high. And for most of the nutrients here, the thick region is somewhere between 6 and 7. There's a couple oddballs. Molybdenum is better off at higher pHs. But other than that, there's a pretty good balance among all the nutrients, micros, macros, secondaries, primaries, if we keep that pH somewhere between 6 and 7. Some plants do like it a little more acid. Blueberries are a great example. Some plants like it a little more alkaline. Alfalfa is a great example of that. But this is a general place you want your soil to be. Moving on. The next thing I'm going to talk about, because it's the theme of the moment, is phosphorus and potassium. By the way, this is a different soil test report. I don't know, among the counties represented here, some of you are still on the old soil test report. Some of you are on the new one, and everybody's going to be on the new one, I think, by sometime next year. In this particular case, the soil test result was 50 pounds per acre P, which put it here in the medium range, and 148 pounds per acre K, which put it in the low range. The crop here is soybean. Previous crop was corn. The management of the soil is no-till, and the previous management was no-till. Soil drainage is moderately well drained. Now, the thing to remember about this particular diagram is these stay the same, but where these bars are changes with the crop. There's a computer program that says soybeans don't need, let's say, quite the pH. So 5.9 is medium. Whereas with alfalfa, 5.9 is going to be low. So you just need to understand that where that colored bar ends up depends on the crop you grow, as well as, of course, as the number you have. All three of these are in the green, partly because the soil test levels are fairly high. Next week, I'm going to talk about the value of this particular number. This is cation exchange capacity. It's given here in 14 milliequivalent per 100 grams, and it's typical. It falls in the middle of the region. And then we give cation saturation, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that next week as well. But I'm going to concentrate on P and K. So this one, for this crop, we've got a medium level of phosphorus and a low level of potassium. You use soil test P and K information to get to what we call the right rate. The rate is by far the easiest thing to adjust among the 4 R's. The others tend to be a little pricier to change. It allows you to put what it's needed where it's needed. And we want people to think of these low, medium things as another expression of the probability of a yield or economic response that is strongly related to them. When this test is low, low to mid-medium, you have a pretty good probability of an economic response. Now, when the soil test is mid-medium, high to very high, you have a lower probability to the point where you might decide not to apply fertilizer at all. This is not a perfect relationship. We have a graph here which shows the probability of a profitable response to fertilizer, ranging from pretty low probability up to pretty high. And notice that for soil test days in the very low category, it's a very high probability, but it's not perfect. There are places where you won't get a response, maybe because of drought, maybe because of disease. As you move from very low to medium, you start to lose a lot of that probability of a positive response that will pay for the fertilizer. It's not zero. If you like to gamble, and some people do, you can apply fertilizer when the soil test level is high and go for this 15% probability of a profitable response. You're not likely to win, but you might. At the high end of the medium range, down in here, you're dropped around 40%. Medium minus is where the break-even point is. You got about a 50-50 chance in here. And then at low and very low, you have a significantly better probability of a profitable yield response with your crop to that soil test level. The reason for this is that yields follow what we call the law of diminishing returns relative to any soil test parameter. This is yield on this axis here. This is soil test increasing. You have a very steep response in these very low and low regions. But by the time you're in the medium region, you're not getting much of a response. And this is just an average number. And by the time you're in the high, you've got almost no chance at all of a response. So when prices are high and soil test levels are in that mid-medium or better range, we have begun to say that for this year, we said it for last year as well, phosphate or potash should be foregone. Probably not likely to be as valuable as the cost of the fertilizer itself. So this region here is the region where UK has added officially, between myself and all my other extension soils colleagues, we've added that as a zone of 0 on the UK recommendations in AGR1. This would be a maintenance rate in this region, but now we're saying maybe maintenance should be foregone. The law of diminishing returns is not the whole story. There's also the probability of response. This was a lot of data determined by my colleague, Josh McGrath. And he plotted relative yield. And by the way, the reason he has some of these higher is because he was using relative to a mid-level phosphorus application check. And there were areas of the field that gave a good response when the soil test was low, and there are a lot of these in here where it really gave a low yield, but there were some that weren't. Phosphorus wasn't the limiting factor. But as you move into the medium and into the high, the number of the points below the line is a lot less than the number of points above the line. So as we increase the soils level, phosphorus is even less limiting in more and more fields, and we end up arguing that by the time you're over in this region with a medium soil test, you don't really show much probability of benefit to a fertilizer application. So if we look at our particular example, where we had 50 pounds of P and 148 pounds of soil test K for a crop of soybeans to be grown, this is where it falls in table 15 of AGR1. The 50 pounds of soil test P falls right in the middle of this range. Notice In this range here, there are 21 salt test units from 40 to 60, and we only give a single rate. Whereas all these other ones are broken down into much smaller 5-pound increments. And then the rate increases as the salt test goes down. But we've got a big group of them here in the upper medium range where we only give this one rate. When I was at the table when this was argued and fought over with some of my older colleagues who've since retired, and we all agreed that we would do this because we were trying to maintain salt test levels at this medium-high break. The same thing is true over here, by the way, with potash, but this sample doesn't qualify because it's down in here. It had 140 some, so it's going to need a fair dose of K2O in order to bring it up enough to make sure that potassium is not limiting that soybean crop's nutrition. So UK has always had this rule: when the salt test K reached 300 and the salt test P reached 60, no fertilizer was recommended. We don't recommend maintenance fertilizer of any kind above that level. What a lot of people didn't realize was we were recommending maintenance fertilizer in that region. A lot of people thought UK didn't believe in maintenance. UK believes in maintenance. It's just not readily apparent in the table. Maybe this should carry a label, but it doesn't. And this year we're saying maintenance fertility, it can be beneficial in future years, but maybe in future years, maybe the price will come down when it's more affordable than it is now. What if the field was a grass clover pasture with an STP of 41 and an STK of 71? You're in the same region. Here, you have maintenance fertilization. So we have applied this concept pretty uniformly. This is a different range on K, particularly it's higher. The soybean one started at about 241, 242. This one, so we're adding more K because grass clover needs more K, but we still have a region of maintenance that covers 30 salt test units of potassium where we're not recommending anything more than maintenance. This one here is for corn. It shows it was broken out differently, but effectively all of these go together, 242 to 300. They're all at the same rate, and then they're all maintenance. Same way over here. Corn is a little more sensitive to phosphorus deficiency, so it doesn't go down to 41. For this number, it starts up here at 46, so we apply more P2O5 for these 5 units of soil test than we would if it was soybean. Now, this is a private labs, which will remain unnamed, but you'll notice up here in the upper left, we've got 199 pounds of phosphorus, 344 pounds of potassium, and you'll notice down here, they make a maintenance recommendation that's not modest: 60 pounds of P2O5 and 80 pounds of K2O. Now, I'm sorry, I don't agree with that. I think this field or this area would easily support a good crop. In this case, the crop intended was corn, without any fertilizer, at least for this year. But this lab made this recommendation, even in the face of the economics that the grower was facing. My colleague, Grant Thomas, who's passed away, had this thing to say about people who put nutrients in the soil bank account, or you might say in the soil. He said the soil bank account does not pay interest. In fact, because of chemical losses to fixation, erosion, it actually, the minute you put nutrients in the field, you're going to have negative interest. You're going to have nutrients that never make their way into a plant, giving the plant economic value. And the other aspect is there's chemical and biological uncertainty in those applications that makes the soil fertilizer bank even less valuable than leaving the dollars in the bank. And doses of needed fertilizer are more efficient at generating revenue than doses of maintenance fertilizer. So that's my point about what they're doing here. Moving away from rate to timing. Timing is really important, and it's a very difficult thing to optimize at times for the different inputs we apply in a farming operation. Lime, for example, we know it needs time to neutralize soil acidity. We like to put lime on in the fall in anticipation that the next crop in the next year will benefit from that. Poultry litter, the organic compounds in the poultry litter, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, need to be mineralized biologically, and that takes some time, not 6 months, but certainly it's applied earlier in the plant's life cycle so that the nutrients are made available at a valuable time. Soluble fertilizers are kind of the flip side, particularly nitrogen. You can't be either too early or too late. You have to be on time. And the warm and cool season crops have different seasonal growth habits and different optimal, especially nitrogen application timings. You have to understand how your crop grows relative to seasonal temperatures, and you have to understand how the nutrient uptake occurs. Growth and uptake tend to follow a sigmoidal pattern like part A, the upper part. And if we look at the rate of change, you have a rapid increase in rate during this period, and then it reaches a maximum, and after that point, it begins to drop off. Consequently, you need to make sure your nutrients are available kind of right here so that when this takeoff occurs, you've got all the nutrients in place that the plant's going to need to reach this maximum up here by having a lot for that maximum rate point in the middle part of its life cycle. This is an example where we're looking at two of the annual crops. This is winter wheat. Its growth cycle, which it comes along, grows rapidly in May, and then is basically done in late June for harvest. And corn, which is planted sometime in early May, and it takes off and it's making a lot of growth. And so it's maturing later. This is your warm season and this is your cool season annual. But if we look at how the soil mineralizes nitrogen from its reserve, from the organic nitrogen pool, this one looks like this. So if you ask yourself, which of these crops is going to depend more on fertilizer and nitrogen for its crop nutrition? Well, it's going to be winter wheat, because the soil is delayed relative to the need of the wheat for nitrogen. The soil is delayed at providing that. And what we find is wheat has a much higher fraction of its nitrogen has to come from added fertilizer or some other input than from the soil reserves themselves. If we look at the cool season grasses, Dr. Teutsch provided me with this figure. We look at cool season grasses, we have two major timings. We have just ahead of the flush of good cool season grass growth here, one application here. And then with a cool season grass like fescue, we get another opportunity, unless it doesn't rain. You know, some of us put on fertilizer this fall and then it didn't rain for 10 weeks. We have another opportunity, and we try to hit that by making sure we have good nitrogen availability here. Whereas if we're growing Bermuda grass, and Bermuda grass is capturing increasing acreage in this part of the state, we're seeing that the optimal timing is significantly later. Early April to get enough nitrogen to make sure that Bermuda grass has what it needs when it peaks. Notice also the Bermuda grass is very dormant throughout this rest of this period, okay? Nothing's happening, it's brown. Cool season grasses like fescue aren't like that. And now Dr. Teutsch is exploring an opportunity that they use in turf, which is to put 40, 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre sometime around Thanksgiving to the 1st of December to set the crop up to get some good tillering and good stand persistence so it takes off, starts even better in this spring period here. But the way in which nitrogen is timed is extremely important depending on the crop you're growing. When it comes to corn, the earlier you tend to apply nitrogen, the more you're ultimately going to need, because we're getting a lot of losses of nitrogen. It's nobody's fault. Nitrogen is hard for the soil to hold. And as our springs have gotten warmer and wetter, we all want to plant corn early, but when should the end go on if we're also wetter and we're going to lose nitrogen? On the moderately well-drained to poorly drained soils, rates of nitrogen can be reduced by up to 35 pounds of N per acre if you delay as much as 2/3 of the N 4 to 6 weeks after planting, when the corn's anywhere from 6 to 10 inches tall. That gives that crop enough time to form a root system that when you apply the bulk of its nitrogen that time, you'll get great efficiency. And this accounts for the total amount of N would also account for anything applied as starter or as pop-up in furrow. The problem we have is we have a lot of producers that are locked in, particularly with the use of anhydrous. They're applying nitrogen 3 weeks before they even plant. And if they don't use a nitrification inhibitor with that, they're getting a lot of conversion of that nitrate to other nitrogen to forms that are easy for that soil to lose. If this is something new that you're thinking about doing, I recommend for success that you split or delay your N on as many acres as you can, but start with your wettest acres. Those are the ones where we see the greatest benefit to this practice. So if you've got a range in soil drainage in fields, start with the fields that are dominated by these more poorly drained or somewhat poorly drained soils, and you're planting corn on them. Think about split applying nitrogen to those. Early nitrogen benefits from a nitrification inhibitor. I've got some good data using N-Serve with anhydrous. When you have delayed applications, and if you put particularly urea nitrogen on the surface, you might want to consider a urease inhibitor to get better efficiency, less loss. Nitrification inhibitors have been around for a long time. The first one was N-Serve. Nitrate itself, because it's negatively charged, it's not held very well by the soil. It can be subject to leaching because of that. But denitrification is a biological process, and it happens when the soil is waterlogged for a certain period of time, and then it extends itself. And what happens is the inhibitor kills those organisms, or at least slows their growth and activity to the point where you have more ammonium for a longer period and you don't lose it, forming nitrate. Instinct is a version of N-Serve that was encapsulated and is now being used with UAN and sometimes with urea. Dicyandiamide is a really old chemistry, comes out of Europe. You have to use a larger amount, but it works. And it's the product called Guardian and a couple of others. There's a brand new chemistry on the market. Coke has it. It's called Centuro. It works. I've used it. It's an extremely good product. And it's the nice thing about Centuro is you can add it to either UAN or anhydrous ammonia. You cannot use it with dry urea because it won't flow afterwards. Even at a low rate, it'll be too sticky. But it works very well with UAN and anhydrous ammonia. And there are some new formulations of these things. Like I said, Instinct has been reformulated to be in the urea space that it wasn't occupying before. You need about 1/2 to 1 pound of active ingredient per acre. In the old nitropyrin version with anhydrous, that was 1 quart. 1 quart carried 1 pound, and that's all you need to have. But this microencapsulation of Instinct allows N-Serve to be used as Instinct on these other 2 nitrogen sources. Dicyandiamide has been reformulated and added to Super U, which is a dry product, and Agritane Plus, which is a liquid product that can be put in UAN. So in those cases, you have a urease inhibitor and a nitrification inhibitor, the DCD, combined together on 2 of the urea products that people use. You don't always need both. When you inject UAN, you don't need a urease inhibitor. But if you're going to dribble it on the surface, then having both might be a good thing to do. Timing of urea can achieve avoidance of volatilization losses. My father, who was one of the first to use urea on the farm in southern Michigan, always timed his urea application just within, he expected rain within 24 hours. Because rainfall is a way of incorporating urea into the soil and reducing the possibility of this enzymatic volatilization. The urease enzyme lives even more concentrated on leaf and residue surfaces. And if you have moist, warm, breezy conditions, you can have significant volatilization losses. Now, because it's less warm prior to May warm, usually losses are less. If you get a half-inch rainfall within 72 hours, you get less loss, or with a urease inhibitor, you get less loss. So this is my setup question. It rained yesterday. It's sunny and breezy for this fellow who's spreading urea. Does this situation call for a urease inhibitor? You bet. It certainly does. He's certainly taking some risk of volatilization losses. Urea granules sitting on a soil surface. These aren't even on a residue surface. This is not a no-till environment. This is a tilled environment. This work was done by Black at Iowa State. And he was able to observe over a period of days here, goes out for a month, that if they were incorporated 1 inch below the surface, there's very little loss. There's some loss, but it's practically zero. Whereas granules sitting on the surface lost a lot in the first 10 days, and then they kept on losing another 10% or so as we went further out. So urea has the potential to volatilize even when it's sitting on bare soil. Urease inhibitors, I have to say many are called, but few actually live up to the billing. So the ones I'm showing here are the ones that I can recommend as having good activity, as long as they're used in the right rate, in the right situation. The enzyme is inhibited by the inhibitor because it causes it to not function. Probably the most popular one is a product called agrotane. NBPT is the active ingredient in agrotane, and it's come off patent. So there are now a lot of these off patent products that contain this active ingredient, and they are good. The difference among them is whether they're in the appropriate concentration. Agrotane, you need about 1.2 pounds of AI per ton, and if you don't get that from a product that's a low concentration, you'll end up with a result you won't like. The thiosulfate salts work. They don't work as well, but they do work, and they can be used with a product like UAN. You can dissolve thiosulfate salt in UAN. There's a product that's an analogous to NBPT. It's called NPPT. It's marketed as Lemus by BASF. It's a reasonably good product. It is not as widely available because, frankly, BASF has not pushed it. There's a new modified NBPT that is under patent. It's a duramide. It's called Anvil, and it's marketed by Coke. And it is a good product. I've actually done research with it. It works pretty well. It's a little better than NBPT if your surface soil acidity level takes you down around 5.5, which happens in no-till environments with corn because we put a lot of nitrogen on the surface or near the surface, and we end up with more soil acidity. Modified NBPT doesn't hydrolyze and become deactivated as much. Agrotane Plus and Super U are both good products for the NBPT they contain. The DCD does nothing to inhibit urease. It's the NBPT that's part of these products that indeed inhibits the urease. Harkening back to what I said earlier, NBPT rates are per ton of fertilizer, not per acre, like the nitropyrin is per acre, but NBPT doesn't work that way. You need 1.2 pounds of AI per ton of urea, or 0.06%. Rate can be as low as 0.4 pounds, but you'll only substantially lower maybe the total volatilization. You'll still lose a fair bit on the front end. If you want to really delay the volatilization so that you can get a rainfall maybe 10 or 14 days later, you would want to have the higher rate of material. I'm going to talk briefly about P and K timing and placement and sources because frankly, there's not much to say. New sources are pretty limited. Mosaic has created a product called Aspire, primarily for the alfalfa market, where it's a combination of muriate of potash, MOP, plus boron. It's either 0.5% or 1% boron. I think it's 0.5%. And when you fertilize alfalfa, you either put on as Aspire or a mixture of Aspire with standard MOP. Mosaic has also created a product called MES-Z. They also make an MES-B one, where they take MAP 1152O, add sulfur to it, elemental sulfur, plus a certain micronutrient. In this case, they add zinc for Kentucky and other states in this part of the world. They make a product that has B, and they have another product that has copper that's sold in Africa. Nutrien saw this and decided that the patent that Mosaic was using wasn't a clean patent. So they are now making a product that is analogous to MES. And I suspect it's going to be priced very competitively with MES, which carries quite a premium relative to standard MAP. None of the other chemical or biological additives, particularly for phosphate, has held up. We've looked at Avail here in Kentucky, which is a product that was sold from a company called Specialty Fertilizer Products. And now it's been bought by another company called Verdesian, and it's never worked for us. It was a chemical additive. None of the microbial products yet have shown up. I'm optimistic about microbial products eventually working. You can't look at rhizobial inoculants and mycorrhizal inoculants for certain species and not realize these bugs have real power to make a difference. But in this space, this fertilizer space, they have not done much. Poultry litter. We tell people use poultry litter. Now in Western Kentucky, you can't get any poultry litter. It's all booked. But a lot of people aren't very careful. They don't always get an analysis. And if you have an analysis, can you use all those nutrients, or are you causing unusual buildups like in phosphorus? Also telling people to fall apply less DAP or MAP if you want to get the benefit of the nitrogen. If you're paying $900 a ton for DAP right now, you're spending almost a third of your money on the nitrogen it contains. And fall applied nitrogen, particularly after a drought, when there's a lot of residual nitrogen left around, is not a good investment. One thing people might want to do is start pushing retailers to offer triple superphosphate, plain old 46O. There's about to be a surge of it on the market because the Moroccans are now irritated with Mosaic, and they've decided they're going to pay the tariff, and they're coming into the US market gangbusters, and they're going strong to make us think about using their product instead of DAP or MAP. If you're going to fall apply less, that means you're going to apply more pre-plant or at plant if you have the equipment on your planter. 2x2 P can be applied at 2/3 to 3/4 of the broadcast rate and achieve comparable yields. But you have to ask yourself if you can afford to add this capability to a planter that doesn't already have it. And if you're going to put this and put seeds close to it, you need to remember not all of it is, so there's usually some nitrogen or potash in these starters, and you have to keep the total N plus K2O to 100 pounds per acre or less to avoid salt injury in our soils. Placement in pastures means you got to manage the animal a bit better. You have to have more uniform nutrient distributions. You have to make the animals more uniformly dung and urinate in those pastures. You can use rotational grazing in the summer, the fall, and early winter to help with this. And you can use bale grazing in fall, winter, and early spring. The reason this works with bale grazing is because the nutrients in a standard bale of grass hay, or not a standard bale, but in a ton of grass hay, is 50 pounds of N, 15 pounds of P2O5, and 50 pounds of K2O. And if you can get those better distributed by causing where the animals bale graze, you can achieve some additional benefits for the forage that follows. This is just an example of rotational grazing, and this is a bad example of bale grazing. And the reason I say this is a bad example is the bales are too close together and you're getting some muddy areas forming. They need to be probably no more than 4 or 6 per acre, according to my colleague, Dr. Halich. Some things to avoid this fall and next spring. Pelletized lime and suspension grade lime are limes. There's no question, but they are too costly for most people to use in forages or row crops. And liquid calcium is mostly calcium chloride, and it's really expensive. In fact, if you want to buy liquid calcium chloride, go to the place where your road department gets it, because that's the liquid salt that's applied on asphalt to improve traction when the ice starts. And trust me, road salt purchases are a lot cheaper per ton than what people are paying for this liquid calcium in a jug. I argue that 1919 and 92330 aren't really where you want to be unless you really need all these nutrients. Better off using a custom blend. Poultry litter has some of the same problems. People sometimes think they need sulfur or copper or iron or manganese, but unless you have some kind of a supporting plant tissue analysis, I don't recommend these, because we have no valid soil test for these nutrients in Kentucky soils. We don't know, we could extract them, but we wouldn't know what the numbers mean, because we haven't a correlation between the soil test value for copper, let's say, and the plant's need for copper. Now, if the plant tissue analysis says the plant is low in copper, there's a better chance you'll get a response and a foliar application might work. Low analysis and some of the microbial products, low analysis means low fertilizer analysis, or that are too good to be true as dry fertilizer replacements, should be avoided. I was recently treated to a situation where someone said a 2.5 gallon jug of a product was equal to 1 ton of triple 10. Well, a ton of triple 10 contains 200 pounds of N, 200 pounds P2O5, and 200 pounds of K2O. And if you think you can pack that into a 2.5 gallon jug, I got news for you. There is no value to liquid humic acid or humus or the humate products, because you think, again, what's in a jug of that stuff? And a soil that only has 1/10% of organic matter has 2,000 pounds of organic matter per acre. That's at 0.1%. Most soils have at least 1%, which is 20,000 pounds per acre. So what are you going to get from a jug of this stuff? Chemical or biological additives that make fertilizer nutrients more available. I'm anticipating there'll be some biologicals down the road that'll help us, but in general, none of these have proven to be very valuable. This is my example. This is a product that shall remain nameless. It's got a good analysis. 11.85 on a foliar product isn't bad. But if we look at crops, alfalfa up here, they wanted, 1 to 2 quarts an acre after each cutting. And then for a lot of the other crops, 1 to 2 quarts per acre. Now, let's say you make 3, 4, 5 applications of this stuff. What are you getting? Well, a 2-quart application, the 2 quarts weighs 5 pounds, weighs about 10 pounds per gallon. That means if you apply 2 quarts per acre, the maximum suggested on the label, this is how much nutrient you actually get in that application. 1/2 pound of N, 1/4 pound of P, 0.4 pound of K. I mean, really? When you look at what crop needs up here, these are row crops, but forages are no different. These things are a smidge. It would take a rate of 10 gallons of this product, 20 applications gives you 10 gallons, and all you're going to get even then is 5 to 10% of the total uptake. So these foliar products, sometimes for the micronutrients, they're fine. They're not this low as 0.2% in this one. You can buy some good boron, good zinc products if you need them and apply them. But for the most part, the foliar products that involve NP or K are pretty much not worth the plastic they're put in terms of what they're going to give you in terms of a return on investment. there's been a lot of talk about pivot bio. And Dr. McGrath, and Dr. Ritchie, and I, and particularly I, had a long negotiation with Pivot Bio, trying to get them to allow us to do a research protocol. Now, in my particular case, I was not taking any Pivot Bio money. I just wanted Pivot Bio product. And they said that I wouldn't get any product unless I decided that I was going to do it their way. And I also had to sign a non-disclosure agreement so strong that UK legal wouldn't even agree to it, because they said they controlled the data until they decided they were releasing it. Well, I'm not a slave to Pivot Bio, so I decided I wouldn't go along with it. But the protocol they chose was really interesting. What we have here is the rate of nitrogen for the corn crop, 180 or 220, and with and without Pivot Bio. On the face of it, at least it looked fair that they had Pivot Bio at each of the two rates and not. But then I discovered that the main focus, I just happened to talk to one of their local reps, said, well, the two treatments we care about are these two. Anybody care to critique that particular arrangement? Remember, this year, Pivot Bio was saying, we're going to replace 40 pounds of nitrogen. Okay, so here's a 40-pound nitrogen differential with Pivot Bio. But the more interesting comparison would be, well, what if you got the same yield here? Because maybe the Pivot Bio wasn't necessary. You got the same yield. There's a lot of producers that wanted to know about Pivot Bio that were using lower rates of nitrogen, and they wanted to take off 40 pounds off of that. Some of the UK recommendations run around 130 to 170 pounds. You take 30 pounds, you take 40 pounds off of that. That's a real consequence if it turns out to be nitrogen deficient crop. And this particular protocol just doesn't fly. I did do some work with another biological this year, but I haven't got the data all calculated. If you want to try some new things to consider, one of the things I recommend as an underutilized tool is plant tissue analysis. Learn how to take some tissue samples, send them to the lab, and how to interpret the report results. Another thing to think about is start testing on occasion for boron in your fields. Consider adding about a half pound of boron per acre if the UK soil test falls below a half pound per acre. If you want to do it foliarly, use a product called Solubor because it's compatible with a lot of other things like fungicides or other things that may go on later. But you might want to jar test it before you put it in a big tank load. When it comes to sulfur, if you are going to soil test for sulfur, and especially on soils that have red or red-brown subsoils, take both a topsoil and a subsoil below 8 inches sample. We've discovered that these red-brown subsoils can actually hold up a fair bit of sulfate. We had a series of wheat trials that were split between Princeton and Lexington. We got responses to sulfur at Lexington. We didn't get them at Princeton. The only factor that relates to that is we had 10 pounds or less sulfate sulfur in the Lexington soils and 20 pounds of sulfate sulfur in the subsoil of the Princeton soils. They both have red or red-brown subsoils, but one was low in sulfur and one was higher. So I'm going to close here with some take-home points. I'm running out of time anyway. I'm going to emphasize soil testing because you need the data. Apply any needed lime as a first priority. And until the prices moderate, let's not do too much maintenance fertilizer. We want to put on fertilizer that's needed, but maintenance rates have a different objective. You're maintaining a soil test. You're feeding the soil, not feeding the crop. Avoid products that are too good to be true. And delayed end timing on crop like corn can mean you can use a lower nitrogen rate. And avoid both losses that you can observe, particularly in corn and sometimes in forages with a urease inhibitor, but avoid those by either delaying the timing, injecting it in corn, you can do that, or using inhibitors. Time your lime and nutrient applications to optimize either cool or warm season plant growth. In pastures, you also have the option of frost seeding clover. which gives you another nitrogen source that you can benefit the pasture with. Implement rotational grazing to improve dung and urine distributions, and feed hay on pastures with low soil test values and move the hay feeding points around to improve the nutrient distribution. So I'll close. Thank you very much. By the way, you can thank Chad Lee for that particular slide. I borrowed it from him. He had a copyright on it, so I acknowledge that. And I'll take any questions, assuming Philip says I've got lots of time. I'm perfectly willing to stay until it's all gone. Thank you.
All right, Doc, I want to start off with one. And before I start off, if you all have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box and we will get to them. For my guys that are right here, if you got questions, raise your hand or something like that and we'll get them asked. But as you pointed out, you're all in a drought. We're in a drought. Fall is usually a good time to take some soil samples, but we can't get the probe in the ground. What suggestions do you have about taking soil tests now?
Well, there are clearly some problems in some soils. We've had a fair number of samples come in, by the way, to both soil tests. We're accumulating soil samples here at Princeton and sending them to Lexington. So Lexington is doing all the work, but we're still collecting samples coming from other. Most people are using probes that are powered probes. A lot of the private contractors that take a lot of samples are not using, human push probes. Okay, so that's how it's getting done. Otherwise, Philip, I would tell you that you just need to put on another 50 pounds of weight and heave at it.
All right, we had one come in from David. Any plant issues with 28% or 32% UAN? You
don't want to put it over the top of corn at the wrong growth stage because it'll burn it pretty good at the rates you use in corn. I've used 28 or 32 in pastures quite successfully because I'm not putting on that much. I'm typically putting on anywhere from 40 to 80 pounds of N. And it's spread out enough. It does burn for a while, but then the crop takes off. I've used it on fescue. I've not used it on Bermuda. So it just depends. If you try to put on 150 pounds of N with UAN and you apply it over the top, you're going to have a problem. You need to dribble it between the rows or you need to inject it. You can dribble it. You just should probably put an inhibitor with it if you dribble it on the surface of a no-till soil that's got a lot of residues on it.
All right, I got a question here. Can we comment a little bit more on the sulfur? I know you and Dr. Ritchie have done studies. You've mentioned that it did show a response, and I've been told that we can't show a response consistently. So can you comment a little bit more on sulfur, please?
I'm going to talk about this a lot more next week, but I will say this. Sulfur is an emerging problem. There's no question about it. We have more and more substantiated reports of sulfur deficiency. We haven't had a very good luck finding one in corn or soybean, but we found them in wheat. We found them in alfalfa. Wheat is a cool season crop, and it doesn't get much sulfur from mineralization of organic sulfur reserves. So that's one of the reasons why we think that's happening. And alfalfa is again, starts off pretty early, and you're trying to get a lot of tonnage. And in some soils, we may not have enough sulfur reserve to support the tonnage. So that may be why we're talking about that crop. But we haven't had very many successful reports in corn particularly. There were one or two in soybean, but they were kind of flaky and they haven't held up well. We're still looking for more issues with sulfur. A lot of growers are applying sulfur prophylactically. If you're worried about sulfur, don't apply more than 10 pounds of S, which is a smidge. It's about 50 pounds of ammonium sulfate per acre. That stuff is really expensive, and you can easily get what you need with 50 pounds if you're really worried about it. But again, I argue, start using plant tissue analysis and start understanding how to interpret those, and that'll help you understand which fields might be better candidates for that sulfur application.
Texas, one of the largest companies.
Okay, Doc, I've got a grower here that's done his homework and looking at some Beck's information, and they're showing where it is a benefit to soybeans in Kentucky. Have you seen anything like that or on that?
I've seen some of the Beck's reports. The problem with Beck's is that they don't replicate, and they don't have a fairly large area that they're working on. I have not been able, and nobody else has either, been able to show what they've shown. So let's just say we've not been able to replicate their unreplicated observations. I'm not saying that we won't find sulfur deficiency in soybean. I think we eventually will, because we're just not releasing enough into the atmosphere to sustain our cropping systems as we intensify those. But we've looked at sulfur under irrigated soybeans, full season soybeans, not double crop, and we haven't found anything. So, and this is on soils where we would expect to find it, out in the purchase where we don't get a lot of sulfate hanging in the subsoil. So I'm not saying they didn't see it. I'm saying I haven't been able to replicate it, and neither has anybody else that I know of in the state. So I'll just take that with a grain.
Okay, moving on to the next question. Let's see. So for example, on P and K recommendations for soybeans, if 30 units are for maintenance, can we get by with 30 units less than the recommended amount for one crop year if the recommended amount levels were low?
No, because the issue there is that you're not only trying to get enough into the crop, you're still having to deal with a soil that is testing low, and it's going to chemically fix part of that P and part of that K you're applying. So when you get below that, you really do want to apply what's recommended. We do not recommend you cut 30 all the way down the line, because you just won't have all that you need to get you the likely economic benefits you expect at those lower soil test levels.
Okay, next one. When making hay, let's see, try that again. When making hay, most years you only get 2 cuttings in Eastern Kentucky, sometimes 3 cuttings, weather dependent. Is it better to fertilize early spring or after the first cutting to increase production? Second part, what is the best NPK combination for hay fields?
I'm going to deal with the second one first. There is no one best combination. That's why you custom blend. You don't use 1919 or something like that, or 92330. What you do is you find out from soil test what the level of P and K you need is, and that's what you fertilize for. In some 3-cut systems, it might be wise to split part of the potassium, maybe a third of it, and apply it after the second cutting, so you have enough to support a third cutting. If you look at nitrogen, there's no doubt that you can't put it all on ahead of the first cutting. But I will say this, if Teutsch's work hangs out, we could put part of our nitrogen on for next spring, put it on in November and December, and then another part after the first cut is taken. But we don't know enough about that. So now the recommendation would be to think about 2 applications, at least in cool season grasses. I was in Georgia for a period of time, and Bermuda grass, if anybody's fooling around with Bermuda grass, you practically have to fertilize each and every cutting you get, because it really hogs down nitrogen, and you don't want to just create a big high protein first cut and then get nothing but little cuts after that.
All right, any more questions? You can put them in the chat, or I guess at this point, feel free to unmute. If you think of some over the week while you're waiting for the next class, feel free to email them to your county agent, and they can get them to me, April, or Dr. Grove himself, and then we can address them since he's going to be here next week, the first part of the session. If no other questions, thank you all, and we will see you 6 o'clock Eastern time next Tuesday night. And we're wanting to address basically anything but NP and K on minerals. Correct, Doc?
Right. And then with a little bit of a digress into CEC interpretation at the end.
Sounds great. Thank you
All right.
all, and have a safe night.
I thank all of you for joining us. Thank you very much.